Welcome back. We're reading 450 from Paddington by Agatha Christie, Chapter 4. The name of Lucy Islesborough had already made itself felt in certain circles. Lucy Islesborough was 32. She had taken a first in mathematics at Oxford, was acknowledged to have a brilliant mind, and was confidently expected to take up a distinguished academic career. But Lucy Islesborough, in addition to scholarly brilliance, had a core of good, sound common sense. She could not fail to observe that a life of academic distinction was singularly ill rewarded. She had no desire whatever to teach, and she took pleasure in contacts with minds much less brilliant than her own. In short, she had a taste for people, all sorts of people, and not the same people the whole time. She also, quite frankly, liked money. To gain money, one must exploit a shortage. Lucy Islesborough hit at once upon a very serious shortage, the shortage of any kind of skilled domestic labor. To the amazement of her friends and fellow scholars, Lucy Islesborough entered the field of domestic labor. Her success was immediate and assured. By now, after a lapse of some years, she was well known all over the British Isles. It was quite customary for wives to say joyfully to husbands, "It will be all right. I can go with you to the States. I've got Lucy Islesborough." The point of Lucy Islesborough was that once she came into a house, all worry, anxiety, and hard work went out of it. Lucy Islesborough did everything. She was unbelievably competent in every conceivable sphere. She looked after elderly parents, accepted the care of young children, nursed the sickly, cooked divinely, got on well with any old-crusted servants that might happen to be, there usually weren't, was tactful with impossible people, soothed habitual drunkards, was wonderful with dogs. Best of all, she never minded what she did. She scrubbed the kitchen floor, dug in the garden, cleaned up dog messes, and carried coal. One of her rules was never to accept an engagement for any long length of time. A fortnight was her usual period, a month at most under exceptional circumstances. For that fortnight, you had to pay the earth, but during that fortnight, your life was heaven. You could relax completely, go abroad, stay at home, do as you pleased, secure that all was going well on the home front in Lucy Islesborough's capable hands. Naturally, the demand for her services was enormous. She could have booked herself up, if she chose, for about 3 years ahead. She had been offered enormous sums to go as a permanency, but Lucy had no intention of being a permanency, nor would she book herself for more than 6 months ahead. And within that period, unknown to her clamoring clients, she always kept certain free periods which enabled her either to take a short, luxurious holiday, since she spent nothing otherwise and was handsomely paid and kept, or to accept any position at short notice that happened to take her fancy, either by reason of its character or because she liked the people. Since she was at liberty to pick and choose among the vociferous claimants for her services, she went very largely by personal liking. Mere riches would not buy you the services of Lucy Islesborough. She could pick and choose, and she did pick and choose. She enjoyed her life very much and found it in a continual source of entertainment. Lucy Islesborough read and reread the letter from Miss Marple. She had made Miss Marple's acquaintance 2 years ago when her services had been retained by Raymond West, the novelist, to go and look after his old aunt who was recovering from pneumonia. Lucy had accepted the job and had gone down to St. Mary Mead. She had liked Miss Marple very much. As for Miss Marple, once she had caught a glimpse out of her bedroom window of Lucy Islesborough really trenching for sweet peas in the proper way, she had leaned back on her pillows with a sigh of relief, eaten the tempting little meals that Lucy Islesborough brought to her, and listened, agreeably surprised, to the tales told by her elderly, irascible maidservant of how I taught that Miss Islesborough a crochet pattern what she'd never heard of. Proper grateful she was, and had surprised her doctor by the rapidity of her convalescence. Miss Marple wrote asking if Miss Islesborough could undertake a certain task for her, rather an unusual one. Perhaps Miss Islesborough could arrange a meeting at which they could discuss the matter. Lucy Islesborough frowned for a moment or two as she considered. She was in reality fully booked up, but the word unusual and her recollection of Miss Marple's personality carried the day, and she rang up Miss Marple straight away, explaining that she could not come down to St. Mary Mead, as she was at the moment working, but that she was free from 2 to 4 on the following afternoon and could meet Miss Marple anywhere in London. She suggested her own club, a rather nondescript establishment, which had the advantage of having several small dark writing rooms which were usually empty. Miss Marple accepted this suggestion, and on the following day the meeting took place. Greetings were exchanged. Lucy Islesborough led her guest to the gloomiest of the writing rooms and said, "I'm afraid I'm rather booked up just at present, but perhaps you'll tell me what it is you want me to undertake?" "It's very simple, really," said Miss Marple. "Unusual, but simple. I want you to find a body." For a moment, the suspicion crossed Lucy's mind that Miss Marple was mentally unhinged, but she rejected the idea. Miss Marple was eminently sane. She meant exactly what she had said. "What kind of a body?" asked Lucy Islesborough with admirable composure. "A woman's body," said Miss Marple. "The body of a woman who was murdered, strangled, actually, in a train." Lucy's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well, that's certainly unusual. Tell me about it." Miss Marple told her. Lucy Islesborough listened attentively without interrupting. At the end, she said, "It all depends on what your friend saw, or thought she saw." She left the sentence unfinished with a question in it. "Elspeth McGillicuddy doesn't imagine things," said Miss Marple. "That's why I'm relying on what she said. If it had been Dorothy Cartwright, now, it would have been quite a different matter. Dorothy always has a good story and quite often believes it herself, and there is usually a kind of basis of truth, but certainly no more. But Elspeth is the kind of woman who finds it very hard to make herself believe that anything at all extraordinary or out of the way could happen. She's most unsuggestible, rather like granite." "I see," said Lucy thoughtfully. "Well, let's accept it all. Where do I come in?" "I was very much impressed by you," said Miss Marple, "and you see I haven't got the physical strength nowadays to get about and do things." "You want me to make inquiries, that sort of thing? But won't the police have done all that? Or do you think they've just been slack?" "Oh, no," said Miss Marple. "They haven't been slack. It's just, I've got a theory about the woman's body. It's got to go somewhere. If it wasn't found in the train, then it must have been pushed or thrown out of the train. But it hasn't been discovered anywhere on the line. So I traveled down the same way to see if there was anywhere where the body could have been thrown off the train and yet wouldn't have been found on the line. And there was. The railway line makes a big curve before getting into Brackhampton, on the edge of a high embankment. If a body were thrown out there when the train was leaning at an angle, I think it would pitch right down the embankment. But surely it would still be found, even there? Oh, yes, it would have been taken away, but we'll come to that presently. Here's the place on this map." Lucy bent to study where Miss Marple's finger pointed. "It's right in the outskirts of Brackhampton now," said Miss Marple, "but originally it was a country house with extensive park and grounds, and it's still there, untouched, ringed round now with building estates and small suburban houses. It's called Rutherford Hall. It was built by a man called Crackenthorpe, a very rich manufacturer in 1884. The original Crackenthorpe's son, an elderly man, is living there still with, I understand, a daughter. The railway encircles quite half of the property." "And you want me to do what?" Miss Marple replied promptly. "I want you to get a post there. Everyone is crying out for efficient domestic help. I should not imagine it would be difficult." "No, I don't suppose it would be difficult. I understand that Mr. Crackenthorpe is said locally to be somewhat of a miser. If you accept a low salary, I will make it up in the proper figure, which should, I think, be rather more than the current rate." "Because of the difficulty?" "Not the difficulty so much as the danger. It might, be dangerous. It's only right to warn you of that. I don't know, said Lucy pensively, that the idea of danger would deter me. I didn't think it would, said Miss Marple. You're not that kind of person. I dare say you thought it might even attract me. I've encountered very little danger in my life, but do you really believe it might be dangerous? Somebody, Miss Marple pointed out, has committed a very successful crime. There has been no hue and cry, no real suspicion. Two elderly ladies have told a rather improbable story. The police have investigated it and found nothing in it. So everything is nice and quiet. I don't think that this somebody, whoever he may be, will care about the matter being raked up, especially if you're successful. What do I look for exactly? Any signs along the embankment, a scrap of clothing, broken bushes, that kind of thing. Lucy nodded. And then? I shall be quite close at hand, said Miss Marple. An old maidservant of mine, my faithful Florence, lives in Brackhampton. She has looked after her old parents for years. They are now both dead, and she takes in lodgers, all most respectable people. She has arranged for me to have rooms with her. She'll look after me most devotedly, and I feel I should like to be close at hand. I would suggest that you mention you have an elderly aunt living in the neighborhood and that you want a post within easy distance of her, and also that you stipulate for a reasonable amount of spare time so that you can go and see her often. Again, Lucy nodded. I was going to Tumina the day after tomorrow, she said. The holiday can wait, but I can only promise 3 weeks. After that, I'm booked up. 3 weeks should be ample, said Miss Marple. If we can't find out anything in 3 weeks, we might as well give up the whole thing as a mare's nest. Miss Marple departed, and Lucy, after a moment's reflection, rang up a registry office in Brackhampton, the manageress of which she knew very well. She explained her desire for a post in the neighborhood so as to be near her aunt. After turning down with a little difficulty and a good deal of ingenuity several more desirable places, Rutherford Hall was mentioned. That sounds exactly what I want, said Lucy firmly. The registry office rang up Miss Crackenthorpe. Miss Crackenthorpe rang up Lucy. 2 days later, Lucy left London en route for Rutherford Hall. Driving her own small car, Lucy Islesborough turned through an imposing pair of vast iron gates. Just inside them was what had originally been a small lodge, which now seemed completely derelict. Whether through war damage or merely through neglect, it was difficult to be sure. A long, winding drive led through large, gloomy clumps of rhododendrons up to the house. Lucy caught her breath in a slight gasp when she saw the house, which was a kind of miniature Windsor castle. The stone steps in front of the door could have done with attention, and the gravel sweep was green with neglected weeds. She pulled an old-fashioned wrought-iron bell, and its clamor sounded, echoing away inside. A slatternly woman, wiping her hands on her apron, opened the door and looked at her suspiciously. "Expected, aren't you?" she said. "Miss Something Barrow, she told me." "Quite right," said Lucy. The house was desperately cold inside. Her guide led her along a dark hall and opened a door on the right. Rather to Lucy's surprise, it was quite a pleasant sitting room, with books and chintz-covered chairs. "I'll tell her," said the woman, and went away shutting the door after having given Lucy a look of profound disfavor. After a few minutes, the door opened again. From the first moment, Lucy decided that she liked Emma Crackenthorpe. She was a middle-aged woman with no very outstanding characteristics, neither good-looking nor plain, sensibly dressed in tweeds and pullover, with dark hair swept back from her forehead, steady hazel eyes, and a very pleasant voice. She said, "Miss Islesborough," and held out her hand. Then she looked doubtful. "I wonder," she said, "if this post is really what you're looking for? I don't want a housekeeper, to supervise things. I want someone to do the work." Lucy said that was what most people needed. Emma Crackenthorpe said apologetically, "So many people, seem to think that just a little light dusting will answer the case. but I can do all the light dusting myself." "I quite understand," said Lucy. "You want cooking and washing up, the housework and stoking the boiler. That's all right. That's what I do. I'm not at all afraid of work. It's a big house, I'm afraid, and inconvenient. Of course, we only live in a portion of it, my father and myself, that is. He's rather an invalid. We live quite quietly, and there's an aga stove. I have several brothers, but they're not here very often. 2 women come in, a Mrs. Kidder in the morning and Mrs. Hart 3 days a week. They do brasses and things like that. You have your own car?" "Yes, it can stand out in the open if there's nowhere to put it. It's used to it." "Oh, there are any amount of old stables. There's no trouble about that." She frowned a moment, then said, "Islesbarrow, rather an unusual name. Some friends of mine were telling me about a Lucy Islesbarrow. The Kennedys?" "Yes, I was with them in North Devon when Mrs. Kennedy was having a baby." Emma Crackenthorpe smiled. "I know they said they'd never had such a wonderful time as when you were there seeing to everything. But I had the idea that you were terribly expensive. The sum I mentioned—" "That's quite all right," said Lucy. "I want particularly, you see, to be near Brackhampton. I have an elderly aunt in a critical state of health, and I want to be within easy distance of her. That's why the salary is a secondary consideration. I can't afford to do nothing. If I could be sure of having some time off most days—" "Oh, of course. Every afternoon till 6, if you like." "That seems perfect." Miss Crackenthorpe hesitated a moment before saying, "My father is elderly and a little difficult sometimes. He's very keen on economy, and he says things sometimes that upset people. I wouldn't like—" Lucy broke in quickly. "I'm quite used to elderly people of all kinds," she said. "I always manage to get on well with them." Emma Crackenthorpe looked relieved. "Trouble with father," diagnosed Lucy. "I bet he's an old tartar." She was apportioned a large, gloomy bedroom, which a small electric heater did its inadequate best to warm, and was shown around the house, a vast, uncomfortable mansion. As they passed a door in the hall, a voice roared out, "That you, Emma? Got the new girl there? Bring her in. I want to look at her." Emma flushed, glanced at Lucy apologetically. The 2 women entered the room. It was richly upholstered in dark velvet. The narrow windows let in very little light, and it was full of heavy mahogany Victorian furniture. Old Mr. Crackenthorpe was stretched out in an invalid's chair, a silver-headed stick by his side. He was a big, gaunt man, his flesh hanging in loose folds. He had a face rather like a bulldog, with a pugnacious chin. He had thick, dark hair, flecked with gray, and small, suspicious eyes. "Let's have a look at you, young lady." Lucy advanced, composed and smiling. "There's just one thing you'd better understand straight away. Just because we live in a big house doesn't mean we're rich. We're not rich. We live simply. Do you hear? Simply. No good coming here with a lot of highfalutin ideas. Cod's as good a fish as turbot any day, and don't you forget it. I don't stand for waste. I live here because my father built the house and I like it. After I'm dead, they can sell it up if they want to, and I expect that they'll want to. No sense of family. This house is well built, it's solid, and we've got our own land round us. Keeps us private. It would bring in a lot for building land, but not while I'm alive. You won't get me out of here until you take me out feet first." He glared at Lucy. "Your house is your castle," said Lucy. "Laughing at me? Of course not. I think it's very exciting to have a real country place all surrounded by town." "Quite so. Can't see another house from here, can you? Fields with cows in them, right in the middle of Brackhampton. You hear the traffic a bit when the wind's that way, but otherwise it's still country." He added, without pause or change of tone, to his daughter, "Ring up that damn fool of a doctor. Tell him the last medicine's no good at all." Lucy and Emma retired. He shouted after them, "And don't let that damned woman who sniffs dust in here. She's disarranged all my books." Lucy asked, "Has Mr. Crackenthorpe been an invalid long?" Emma said rather evasively, "Oh, for years now. This is the kitchen." The kitchen was enormous. A vast kitchen range stood cold and neglected, and Aga stood demurely beside it. Lucy asked times of meals and inspected the larder. Then she said cheerfully to Emma Crackenthorpe, "I know everything now. Don't bother. Leave it all to me." Emma Crackenthorpe heaved a sigh of relief as she went up to bed that night. "The Kennedys were quite right," she said. "She's wonderful." Lucy rose at 6 the next morning. She did the house, prepared vegetables, assembled, cooked, and served breakfast. With Mrs. Kidder, she made the beds, and at 11 o'clock they sat down to strong tea and biscuits in the kitchen. Mollified by the fact that Lucy had no airs about her, and also by the strength and sweetness of the tea, Mrs. Kidder relaxed into gossip. She was a small, spare woman with a sharp eye and tight lips. "Regular old skinflint, he is. What she has to put up with. All the same, she's not what I call downtrodden. Can hold her own all right when she has to. When the gentlemen come down, she sees to it there's something decent to eat." "The gentlemen?" "Yes, big family it was. The eldest, Mr. Edmund, he was killed in the war. Then there's Mr. Cedric. He lives abroad somewhere. He's not married. Paints pictures in foreign parts. Mr. Harold's in the city, lives in London, married an earl's daughter. Then there's Mr. Alfred. He's got a nice way with him, but he's a bit of a black sheep. Been in trouble once or twice. And there's Miss Edith's husband, Mr. Bryan. Ever so nice he is. She died some years ago, but he's always stayed one of the family. And there's Master Alexander, Miss Edith's little boy. He's at school, comes here for part of the holidays always. Miss Emma's terribly set on him." Lucy digested all this information, continuing to press tea on her informant. Finally, reluctantly, Miss Kidder rose to her feet. "Seem to have got along a treat we do this morning," she said wonderingly. "Want me to give you a hand with the potatoes, dear? They're already done." "Well, you are a one for getting on with things. I might as well be getting along myself, as there doesn't seem anything else to do." Miss Kidder departed, and Lucy, with time on her hands, scrubbed the kitchen table, which she had been longing to do, but which she had put off so as not to offend Mrs. Kidder, whose job it was properly. Then she cleaned the silver till it shone radiantly. She cooked lunch, cleared it away, washed up, and at 2:30 was ready to start exploration. She had set out the tea things ready on a tray with sandwiches and bread and butter, covered over with a damp napkin to keep them moist. She strolled first around the gardens, which would be the normal thing to do. The kitchen garden was sketchily cultivated with a few vegetables. The hothouses were in ruins. The paths everywhere were overgrown with weeds. A herbaceous border near the house was the only thing that showed free of weeds and in good condition, and Lucy suspected that had been Emma's hand. The gardener was a very old man, somewhat deaf, who was only making a show of working. Lucy spoke to him pleasantly. He lived in a cottage adjacent to the big stable yard. Extending out from the stable yard, a back drive led through the park, which was fenced on either side of it, and under a railway arch into a small black lane. Every few minutes, a train thundered along the main line over the railway arch. Lucy watched the trains as they slackened speed going round the sharp curve that encircled the Crackenthorpe property. She passed under the railway arch and out into the lane. It seemed a little-used track. On the one side was the railway embankment. On the other was a high wall which enclosed some tall factory buildings. Lucy followed the lane until it came onto a street of small houses. She could hear a short distance away the busy hum of main road traffic. She glanced at her watch. A woman came out of a house nearby, and Lucy stopped her. "Excuse me, can you tell me if there is a public telephone near here?" "Post office, just at the corner of the road." Lucy thanked her and walked along until she came to the post office, which was a combination shop and post office. There was a telephone box at one side. Lucy went into it and made a call. She asked to speak to Miss Marple. A woman's voice spoke in a sharp bark. She's resting, and I'm not going to disturb her. She needs her rest. She's an old lady. Who shall I say called? Miss Islesbarrow. There's no need to disturb her. Just tell her that I've arrived and everything is going on well, and that I'll let her know when I have any news. She replaced the receiver and made her way back to Rutherford Hall. That's the end of Chapter 4. Join me soon for Chapter 5. And don't forget to hit subscribe to my channel and go back to my homepage where you can find all the playlists of the different books available and all their chapters within. Thanks so much for joining me, everyone. See you next time. Bye.